The Sherman's track bites into loose gravel, spitting stones over the edge of a 200-foot drop, and Corporal Eddie Marsh feels the whole 30-ton machine shift left, just an inch, maybe two, but enough that his stomach clenches and his hand shoots out to brace against the turret wall. Nobody says a word. The only sounds are the grind of the engine, the hiss of wind through the commander's hatch, and the metallic creak of suspension that shouldn't be creaking like that. This is Route 65, a GO track the engineers swore could carry a platoon of M4 Shermans up the spine of the Apennines toward the Gothic line, and right now, in the cold gray morning of October 1944, Eddie isn't convinced they were right. He's the gunner in the third tank of the column, a machine the crew calls Ruthless because the name was stenciled on the turret by the previous gunner, a kid from Tennessee who took a sniper's bullet through the viewport 3 weeks ago and never got to explain the joke. Eddie doesn't mind inheriting the name. He inherited the seat, the periscope with the cracked left lens, and the smell of burnt oil that never quite leaves the turret basket. What he minds is this road, this cliff, and the fact that Lieutenant Callahan up in the lead tank has refused to slow down despite the rain-slick stone and the yawning nothing on their left flank. The Apennines don't forgive mistakes. Eddie knows that. Everyone in the platoon knows that. But the schedule says they need to reach the ridgeline by noon to support an infantry push, and schedules in this war are written in blood. Marsh is 23, from a manufacturing town outside Pittsburgh, where his father worked a lathe in a plant that made casings for artillery shells. Eddie grew up around metal, around the idea that if you measure twice and cut once, things fit together and don't fall apart. The Army made him a tanker because he scored high on the mechanical aptitude test and didn't flinch when the recruiter showed him pictures of burned-out panzers. He's been in Italy since Salerno, seen the plains south of Rome and the hills north of Florence, watched good crews get chewed up by 88mm guns and Panzerfausts, learned that a Sherman is fast and reliable and absolutely will not stop a German anti-tank round if it wants to come through. He's also learned that survival is about small things, keeping your hatch cracked so you can bail fast, never sitting directly behind the ammo rack, listening to the driver's breathing because Sergeant Kowalski breathes different when he's losing traction. Right now, Kowalski is breathing hard. Eddie can hear it through the intercom, short and clipped, the way a man breathes when he's fighting the levers and realizing the tank isn't responding the way it should. The road is barely 12 feet wide, carved into the mountainside by Italian laborers a generation ago, and the edge is a crumble of frost-broken rock that offers no purchase, no warning, just a straight fall into a ravine choked with scrub pine and boulders the size of freight cars. The platoon is stretched single file, nose to tail, because there's no room to maneuver, no room to turn around, and if something goes wrong up front, the whole column is stuck. Eddie shifts his weight in the gunner's seat, feels the tank sway again, and tightens his grip on the traverse wheel. His loader, a lanky kid from Iowa named Becker, is wedged into the left side of the turret with a 75mm shell cradled in his lap, eyes locked on the ready rack, jaw working a piece of gum that stopped tasting like anything an hour ago. The radio crackles. Lieutenant Callahan's voice tight and clipped. All red elements, we have movement on the high ground, 2 o'clock, range unknown. Button up and stay sharp. Eddie's tank commander, Staff Sergeant Harlan, drops into the turret and yanks the hatch shut with a clang that reverberates through the hull. Harlan is 31, old for a tanker, a man with a face like a hatchet, and a voice that never rises above conversational even when the world is exploding. He was a machinist in Detroit before the war, worked on engine blocks for Packard, and he has a way of talking about the Sherman like it's a temperamental woman who needs coaxing, not bullying. He saved Eddie's life twice. Once by spotting a POC 40 before it fired, once by ordering a reverse when every instinct said to push forward, and Eddie would follow him into hell if Harlan asked, which is more or less what they're doing right now. Marsh, Harlan says, settling into the commander's seat and peering through his periscope. You see anything on that ridge? Eddie scans right, hand on the elevation wheel, eyes pressed to the gun sight. The mountainside is a jumble of gray rock and skeletal trees, autumn-stripped and wind-bent, offering 1,000 places for an observer to hide, a forward artillery spotter with binoculars and a radio. The Germans have been falling back for weeks, but they're not running. They're trading space for time, setting ambushes, dropping bridges, sowing mines, making every mile cost American blood. The Gothic line is supposed to be the last major defensive position before the Po Valley, and the closer the Allies get, the harder the Wehrmacht fights. Eddie's seen it. Panthers hull down on ridgelines, Nebelwerfers that scream like banshees before they turn a road into a crater field, snipers who wait for tank commanders to pop their hatches for a better view. Negative, Eddie says. Could be anything up there. Could be everything, Harlan mutters. The explosion when it comes is not a surprise. What surprises Eddie is how close it is. The shell hits 30 yards ahead, right in front of the lead tank, and the blast is a white-hot hammer of sound and pressure that makes the Sherman shudder on its tracks. A second shell follows, then a third, walking up the column, 105mm German artillery. And Eddie hears Callahan yelling on the radio, words lost in static and the roar of detonations. The lead tank lurches forward, trying to gain speed, trying to get out of the kill zone, and the second tank, Dogface, crewed by a corporal named Ortiz, slews right, tracks scrabbling for purchase on the wet stone. A fourth shell lands on the uphill side of the road, and the concussion sends a shower of rock fragments clattering off Ruthless's turret. Kowalski guns the engine, and Eddie feels the tank surge forward, closing the gap, and then everything goes wrong at once. Dogface loses traction. Eddie sees it through the periscope. The rear of Ortiz's tank swings left, toward the edge, and the tracks spin uselessly on a patch of oil or mud or blood. Something slick, something that shouldn't be there. The Sherman tilts just a few degrees, but it's enough. The right track catches on a lip of stone. The left track lifts, and for one frozen heartbeat the tank teeters on the brink. 30 tons of steel and fuel and ammunition balanced on a fulcrum of crumbling rock. Eddie watches Ortiz throw open his hatch and haul himself out. And the driver, a quiet guy from Nebraska whose name Eddie can never remember, scrambles onto the front glacis, hands clawing for a grip, and then the rock gives way and Dogface slides backward, almost gently, until it isn't gentle at all. The tank rolls. It goes over the edge turret first, flipping in midair, and Eddie hears the crash, a sound like a cathedral collapsing, metal screaming against stone, and then a secondary explosion as something inside the hull ignites. Flames blossom from the engine deck, orange and black, and the Sherman tumbles end over end, bouncing off the cliff face, shedding pieces, a tread, a fender, the main gun barrel snapping like a twig, and disappears into the ravine below. The noise is immense, a rolling thunder of destruction that drowns out the artillery. And then, abruptly, silence. No. Not silence. Eddie hears the crackle of fire, the hiss of escaping fuel, and through the intercom Harlan's voice rough and shaken. "Marsh, you see them? Did they get out?" Eddie saw Ortiz and the driver bail. He didn't see the rest of the crew. The gunner, a replacement from the States who'd been with them less than a week, and the loader, a Mexican kid from El Paso who laughed too loud and wrote letters to his mother every night, Eddie didn't see them get clear, which means they're still inside. Harlan is already moving, keying the radio, trying to raise Callahan, trying to coordinate, but the artillery starts up again, shells landing closer now, and the platoon is trapped, pinned on a narrow ledge with no cover and no way to go back. Kowalski edges Ruthless forward, and Eddie realizes with cold certainty that they're going to have to leave Dogface where it fell. Leave whoever's down there to burn or crawl or die, because stopping means the whole column dies. That's the math of mountain warfare. That's the arithmetic of survival. Eddie's stomach twists, but he keeps his eye to the gun sight, scanning the high ground, looking for the guns that are killing them. Harlan makes the call. "All red elements, keep moving. We can't stop here." And they don't. The platoon crawls forward, past the torn earth where Dogface went over, past the smell of burning diesel and scorched paint, and Eddie feels something inside him harden. A small cold part of his soul that decides this is just how it is. This is just how it goes. Later, if there is a later, he'll think about the kid from El Paso. Right now, he thinks about the traverse wheel under his hand, and the 75mm shell Becker is loading, and the Germans somewhere in the rocks who are trying very hard to kill him. They make it another mile before the road narrows even further, squeezing between a cliff face on the right and a drop-off on the left that seems deeper, steeper, more final than the last one. The artillery has stopped, but Eddie doesn't trust the silence. Harlan has the hatch cracked, head and shoulders out, scanning with binoculars, and Kowalski is nursing the Sherman forward at walking speed, feeling for solid ground. The tank weighs 33 tons loaded, and Eddie can feel every ounce of it pressing down on tracks that are barely 18 inches wide. Tracks that are designed for mud and sand and open fields, not this nightmare of loose stone and ice-slicked granite. The suspension creaks. The engine growls. Becker has stopped chewing his gum. Then the fuel tanks rupture. Eddie doesn't see it happen. He's inside the turret, eyes on the gun sight. But he hears it, a sharp metallic crack followed by a wet sloshing sound, and then Harlan is shouting, voice high and urgent. "We're leaking! Kowalski, stop, stop!" But Kowalski has already stopped, and Eddie smells it now. The sharp chemical reek of gasoline mixing with diesel. And he knows, everyone in the tank knows, that this is the worst possible place for a fuel leak. Because one spark, one stray bit of shrapnel, one electrical short in the wiring that runs through the engine compartment, and the whole Sherman becomes a rolling crematorium. American tankers have a word for it. A Ronson after the cigarette lighter company, because Shermans light up on the first strike. It's a joke that isn't funny, a nickname that kills morale, and right now Eddie is living it. Harlan's voice, steady despite everything. Everybody out, now. Becker moves first, dropping the shell he was holding and scrambling for the turret hatch, and Eddie reaches for his own harness release, fingers fumbling with the buckle, and that's when he feels the tank shift again, not forward or backward but down, the whole right side sinking as the ground underneath gives way. Kowalski screams something unintelligible, the engine roars, and Eddie's world tilts 45 degrees. He slams into the side of the turret, shoulder first, and his harness catches him, straps digging into his chest, and he hears Becker yell and then the sound of the loader hitting the hatch and bouncing off, tumbling into the turret basket in a tangle of limbs. The Sherman is sliding. Eddie can feel it, the slow, inexorable pull of gravity. The tracks spinning uselessly, and through the periscope he sees the road disappear, replaced by sky, replaced by the gray stone face of the cliff rushing past. Harlan is gone. He must have jumped when the tank tilted. And Kowalski is gone too. And Eddie realizes with a clarity that feels like ice water in his veins that he's still strapped into the gunner's seat, 30 feet above a 200-foot drop, in a tank that's about to go over the edge. He claws at the harness buckle. It's jammed, twisted by the impact, and his hands are shaking, gloves slick with sweat, and the Sherman is tilting further, turret swinging down, and Eddie sees fire, actual fire, licking up from the rear of the hull where the fuel tanks have split open, and something, a wire or a hot surface or the manifold, has ignited the fumes. Flames spread across the engine deck, small at first, then growing, and the heat hits Eddie's face through the open turret basket, a furnace blast that makes his eyes water. Becker is trying to reach him, one hand on the loader's hatch, the other stretching toward Eddie, and Eddie lunges for it, fingers closing on Becker's wrist, and then the Sherman goes over. The fall is not instantaneous. It's a rolling, tumbling descent that lasts forever and no time at all. The tank flips, and Eddie is weightless for a heartbeat, still strapped in, still holding Becker's wrist, and then the turret hits the cliff face and the impact tears them apart. Eddie's head snaps back, helmet cracking against the gun sight, and his vision goes white, then red, then gray. The Sherman bounces, metal shrieking, and Eddie hears the main gun barrel shear off, hears the turret ring grind against the hull, hears something inside him crack, a rib, maybe two, and pain floods his chest, sharp and bright and impossible to ignore. The tank flips again, and this time Eddie loses his grip on the traverse wheel, and his body slams into the breech of the 75mm gun, and the harness finally gives way, strap snapping, and he's thrown forward, head first, into the gunner's periscope mount. Then the Sherman hits bottom. The impact is a concussion that rattles Eddie's teeth and drives the air from his lungs. The tank lands on its side, turret facing downslope, hull half buried in loose scree and shattered pine. The engine is still running. Incredibly, impossibly, the engine is still running. And Eddie can hear the track spinning in empty air, the transmission grinding, the fan belt squealing. Smoke pours into the turret from the engine compartment, thick and black and toxic. The smell of burning rubber and melting insulation, and Eddie gags, lungs seizing, and he knows if he doesn't move right now, he's going to die here, suffocated in the wreckage of a tank that's still on fire. He forces his eyes open. His vision is doubled, blurred, and he tastes blood in his mouth, but he can see the gunner's seat, the breech of the 75 meters, the inside of the turret canted at a crazy angle. Flames are eating through the engine bulkhead, and Eddie can feel the heat on his back, his neck, and he reaches for the harness buckle, realizes it's already open, the straps hanging loose, and drags himself forward inch by inch over the turret floor that's now a wall. His ribs scream. His left arm isn't working right, numb from the shoulder down, and he uses his right hand to pull himself toward the gunner's position, toward the seat that's now horizontal, and he collapses into it, breath coming in ragged gasps. The turret is jammed. Eddie realizes this as his head clears, as the adrenaline overrides the pain and his training kicks in. The Sherman landed on a boulder or a ledge, and the turret ring is bent, frozen at an angle that points the main gun upslope, back toward the road. The hand crank for the traverse won't move. Eddie tries it, putting his weight into it, and the mechanism is dead, locked solid. The elevation wheel still has some play, maybe 10 degrees up or down, and Eddie's hand moves to it automatically, muscle memory taking over, and he looks through the gun sight, and he sees them. Shadows, moving along the edge of the cliff. 4, maybe 5 figures, silhouetted against the sky, working their way down the slope toward the wreckage. German infantry, drawn by the noise, by the smoke, by the column of flame rising from the Sherman's engine deck. They're not hurrying. Why would they? They think the crew is dead. Think this is just salvage. A hulk to be stripped for intelligence, dog tags to be collected, maybe a sidearm or a watch to be pocketed. Eddie can see them clearly now, closer, rifles slung, moving with the casual confidence of men who believe the fighting is over. They don't know he's alive. Eddie's hand closes on the elevation wheel. His vision swims, and he blinks hard, trying to focus, trying to align the reticle in the gun sight with the lead German, a man in a field gray overcoat who's carrying a stick grenade on his belt. The turret is stuck, but the gun can still elevate, can still depress, and Eddie cranks the wheel, feeling the breech shift, feeling the barrel move, slowly, too slowly, until the sight picture steadies. The German is maybe 60 yards away, picking his way down a goat trail, and Eddie can see his face now. A young face, unshaven, tired. The Sherman's gun is still loaded. Eddie remembers Becker chambering a round before the fall, and he reaches for the firing mechanism, fingers closing on the grip, and he realizes his hand is shaking so badly he can barely hold on. Smoke is filling the turret, and the heat is unbearable, and Eddie knows the fire is going to reach the ammunition any second now, knows the whole tank is going to cook off and turn into a bomb, but he also knows that if those Germans reach the bottom of the ravine, if they find Harlan and Kowalski and Becker, assuming any of them are still alive, his crew is finished. He fires. The 75mm roars, and the recoil slams the breech back, and Eddie's world is noise and smoke and the acrid stink of cordite. Through the gun sight, he sees the shell hit the slope 10 feet above the lead German, sees the blast throw dirt and rock, sees the man drop flat and the others scatter. Eddie cranks the elevation wheel, drops the barrel a fraction, and realizes with a sick lurch that the ready rack is empty. Becker must have dropped the spare rounds when the tank went over, and the main gun is a single-shot weapon now, useless unless he can reload it, and he can't, because his left arm is dead weight and the ammunition is stored in racks welded to the hull floor that's now a wall, and he can barely breathe, let alone haul a 40-pound shell across the tilted turret. But the Germans don't know that. They're pinned, crouched behind rocks, shouting to each other in a language Eddie doesn't understand, and one of them, the man with the grenade, raises his rifle and fires, and the round hits the Sherman's turret with a sharp ping that makes Eddie flinch. They think the tank is operational, think there's a full crew inside, and as long as they think that, they're not advancing. Eddie leans on the elevation wheel, traversing the gun back and forth as much as the jammed mechanism allows, making noise, making a show of it, and he sees the Germans pull back 30 yards, 40, retreating up the slope toward the road, and then the bow machine gun opens up. Eddie's head snaps around and he sees, through the smoke, through the blur of his vision, movement in the hull. Kowalski. The driver is still in the tank, wedged into his compartment, and he's found the .30 caliber Browning mounted in the bow, and he's firing, short controlled bursts, raking the slope, forcing the Germans to stay down. Eddie's chest tightens, relief and terror mixing, because Kowalski being alive means Kowalski is trapped in the hull with the engine fire. Trapped in a compartment that's turning into an oven. And Eddie can hear him over the intercom. The system still works somehow, coughing, choking on smoke but still firing. "Marsh!" Kowalski gasps, voice raw. "You? You still in there?" "Yeah," Eddie manages. "Yeah, I'm here. I can't move. Legs are pinned. Can you get out?" Eddie looks at the turret hatch above him, now on the side of the tank, half buried in scree. He looks at his left arm, useless. He looks at the fire eating through the engine bulkhead, flames spreading to the ammunition racks, and he knows the answer is no. He can't get out, not quickly enough, not without help. But he also knows that if he tells Kowalski that, the driver is going to panic, is going to stop shooting, and the Germans are going to rush the tank, and everyone dies. "I'm working on it," Eddie lies. "Keep them off us." Kowalski fires again, longer bursts now, desperate, and Eddie hears German voices shouting, hears boots on stone, and he realizes with a cold shock that the enemy is splitting up, some of them staying upslope to provide covering fire, others circling around to flank the wreck from below. They're not idiots. They know the tank is crippled, know the crew is dying, and all they have to do is wait for the fire to finish the job, or rush the hull and throw grenades through the hatches. Eddie cranks the elevation wheel, trying to bring the main gun to bear on the downslope approach, but the traverse is still frozen, and the best he can do is aim at the slope above, trying to keep the Germans honest, trying to make them think twice. His ribs are on fire, his lungs are full of smoke, and his vision is narrowing, tunnel vision, the world shrinking to the circle of the gun sight and the shadows moving beyond it. and then he hears it. A voice, American, distant but clear, shouting from somewhere above. "Covering fire! Covering fire!" Harlan. Staff Sergeant Harlan is alive, and he's on the cliff edge with the rest of the platoon, and Eddie hears the bark of 50 caliber machine guns, hears the heavier thump of a Sherman's main gun, and through the gun sight he sees the Germans on the slope break and run, scrambling for cover as the platoon lays down suppressing fire. The enemy soldiers disappear into the rocks, and Eddie slumps forward, forehead resting against the gun sight, breath coming in sobs. Kowalski's voice, weak now, barely audible. "Marsh. I can't. The smoke." "Hold on," Eddie says, and he doesn't know if he's saying it to Kowalski or to himself. "Just hold on." The fire reaches the ammunition. The first round cooks off with a crack like a lightning strike, and the turret fills with shrapnel, bits of casing and propellant scattering like hail. Eddie throws his good arm over his face, feels something hot slice his forearm, and the second round goes. Then the third, a chain reaction, and the Sherman bucks, the hull ringing like a bell. Eddie is screaming, he realizes, screaming without sound, and the intercom is dead, and he can't hear Kowalski anymore, can't hear anything except the roar of the fire and the hammering of his own heart. But the Germans stay back. The platoon keeps firing, and the enemy doesn't rush the wreck, doesn't try to finish the job, and Eddie realizes they're buying time. Harlan and Callahan and whoever else is up there, they're keeping the Germans pinned while someone, Becker maybe, or Ortiz if he survived, climbs down the ravine to pull survivors out of the hull. Eddie tries to move, tries to drag himself toward the turret hatch, but his body won't respond, and the pain is a white-hot spike through his chest, and he thinks, with a strange detached calm, that he's going to die here after all. Burned alive or suffocated or blown apart when the rest of the ammunition goes up. But he doesn't. Hands grab him, rough, urgent hands, and Eddie is lifted, dragged, hauled through the turret hatch and into daylight. He sees sky, sees smoke, sees faces he doesn't recognize, infantry maybe, medics, and someone is shouting that the tank is going to blow. And Eddie is carried down the slope, over rocks and through scrub, and deposited on flat ground 20 yards from the wreck. He tries to ask about Kowalski, tries to form the words, but his throat is raw and his voice is gone, and all he can do is lie there, staring at the sky, while the Sherman burns. The explosion, when it comes, is anticlimactic. The remaining ammunition cooks off in a series of small pops and bangs, and the fuel tanks rupture fully, and the fire consumes what's left of the hull. Eddie watches it from the stretcher, too exhausted to move, too broken to care, and he counts the faces around him. Harlan, soot-streaked and bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Becker, one arm in a makeshift sling, looking 10 years older. Ortiz and his driver, battered but alive. Kowalski is there too, impossibly dragged from the hull by infantry who descended the ravine under fire, both legs shattered below the knee, unconscious but breathing. Eddie stares at him, at the medic working over him, and something inside Eddie's chest unclenches. Just a fraction, they don't get Kowalski's legs. The doctors at the field hospital amputate below the knee, both sides, and Kowalski is evacuated to Naples, then back to the States, and Eddie never sees him again. Becker goes back to the platoon after a week, and Eddie follows a month later, ribs taped, arm in a cast, and they don't talk about the ravine, don't talk about the fire, don't talk about the fact that Eddie stayed in the turret and kept the gun moving while the tank burned around him. Harlan writes him up for a Silver Star, but the paperwork gets lost somewhere between the battalion and division headquarters, and Eddie doesn't push it. He doesn't want the medal. He wants to forget. But he can't forget the sound of the Germans' boots on stone, getting closer. He can't forget the heat of the fire on his neck, or the weight of the elevation wheel under his hand, or Kowalski's voice over the intercom, choking and desperate. He can't forget that he fired one shot, one single 75mm round, and convinced 5 enemy soldiers that a burning, crippled Sherman was still a threat. It wasn't tactics, it wasn't bravery. It was just a gunner, half dead, refusing to let go of the only thing he could still control. The platoon fights its way to the Gothic line, and then past it, into the Po Valley, and Eddie survives the war, goes home to Pittsburgh, works in the same plant his father worked in, and never tells anyone what happened on Route 65. When people ask about Italy, he says it was cold and wet and the Germans fought hard. And that's all he says. The men who were there, Harlan, Becker, Ortiz, they don't talk about it either. Some things don't need words. Kowalski lives to be 67, dies of a heart attack in a VA hospital in Ohio, and Eddie reads about it in a newsletter from the Division Association. He thinks about writing to Kowalski's family. Thinks about telling them that their husband and father held off an enemy assault with a bow machine gun while trapped in a burning tank, and that Eddie wouldn't have made it out if Kowalski hadn't kept firing. But he doesn't write. He folds the newsletter, puts it in a drawer, and goes back to work. The Sherman, ruthless, is never recovered. It stays where it fell, 200 feet down a ravine in the Apennines, rusting slowly into the mountain, another piece of scrap metal in a war that scattered scrap across half the world. In the 1970s, a group of Italian hikers find it, take photographs, post them in a local history journal. The turret is still intact, the main gun barrel missing, and inside the wreck, someone finds a dog tag wedged into the gunner's seat. It belongs to a replacement, the kid from Tennessee who died 3 weeks before Eddie inherited the seat. The tag goes into a museum in Bologna, and no one ever connects it to the story of the tank, to the fall, to the fire, to the gunner who stayed at his post while the world ended around him. If stories of tank crews who held the line with broken equipment and sheer stubborn refusal to quit pull you in, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and dropping a comment about what kind of armored improvisation or desperate last stand you'd want to hear next.